Wonderful. Welcome, everyone. We really appreciate you taking the time to join us this evening to learn a little bit more about gap year opportunities. So, this is our Gap Year 101. This will be a recorded session, as you just saw. So, we will be providing this recording after this evening in case you'd like to refer back to anything or for those who had signed up but were unable to join us tonight. So, really excited to have you all here. I'm going to give a brief introduction before handing it over to Holly Bull, who is our accredited Gap Year counselor who's going to give you the full rundown of Gap Year 101 this evening. So my name is Margot Moore, and I work for USA Gap Year Fairs and Go Overseas. I am the co-director of the fairs, and I'm also the outreach and special projects manager at Go Overseas. So excited to be with you this evening. A little bit of a background about me. I have been in the gap year industry for almost 10 years now. So I actually started out, well, back in high school and college, I studied abroad. I did a couple of semesters abroad in high school, actually. So while not a traditional gap year, I did spend time abroad in that same time period. And then I went on to work for an experiential education company that runs gap year programs. That's one of our providers here, and started out as a gap year um, program leader. So I was out in the field with students and then ended up running programs from the administrative side for about 7 years before transitioning over to work at Go Overseas at the end of last summer. So I am super passionate about experiential education opportunities and all that gap years can provide for a student at this time in your lives. So while Holly's the expert giving you all the information, I'm super happy to answer questions that might pop up during the presentation as well. So I know I've mentioned both USA Gap Year Fairs as well as Go Overseas. So just to let you know a little bit more about what those organizations are. So the USA Gap Year Fairs is an event series that runs anywhere from 20 to 40 different events around the country, as well as virtual events every year during this time period. So January and February, as this is a really meaningful time for seniors in particular to be looking at gap year programs for the following fall and spring. So every year we run these events, and have been for many years now. And the virtual events are a really great resource in case our in-person events are not coming to a place near you or a city near you. And GoOverseas.com is what powers the USA Gap Year Fairs. And Go Overseas is essentially an online search platform that has well beyond gap years. It does have a number of different gap year opportunities, but also has, as you can see here, study abroad, internships abroad, teach and work abroad, or TEFL courses, language courses abroad. So all sorts of different program opportunities. And I like to think of it as a sort of Yelp for programs where alumni can go on, parents of alum can go on and leave reviews. And so it's an opportunity for you as you're narrowing down your options to potentially be able to read reviews of actual past participants and understand what the experience is really like for someone who's participating in that program. So definitely would encourage you to peruse the website, especially if you're starting to narrow down programs or even if you're early in your experience, just to get some real reviews from past participants. We have a number of different resources that I'll be sharing with you after this event tonight. So we do have our 2025 Gap Year Guide, and we have a digital version that I will send out to all of you that does include a bunch of information about programs that are attending all of our fairs. It also has information about the Gap Year Association, which is the accrediting body for gap year programs, info on our scholarship and such, and much more in there. One resource in particular that I'm excited to share with you is our gap matcher. So you can actually scan this QR code in the upper right-hand corner of this screen. And this is a really great tool. It's more or less like a quiz. So you can put in some of the main things that you're looking for in a gap year experience, and it will pop out a couple of different options for you. So whether you're like early on in the experience and not sure what you want to do, or you kind of narrowed it down and curious if it's going to validate that idea or choice for you, it can be a really great resource. I also want to highlight that Go Overseas is offering a $5,000 scholarship. We do this every year through the USA Gap Year Fairs. And this is a really awesome opportunity to help fund your gap year. We understand that, a gap year experience can, for some, be really, the financial barrier can be steep at times. And we really want to try to make it more accessible. So for anyone who's a senior or anyone who's 17 to 20 years old and planning to take gap time in 2025, we are excited to basically come surprise you at your school with a massive check for $5,000. This is Ash, who was our winner from last year and who's participating in one of our eligible programs this year. Another thing that comes with this scholarship is the opportunity to work with one of our accredited gap year counselors. And Ash actually was working with Holly this year for their gap year, which has been really awesome. So that's a really great tool that's a part of the scholarship experience as well. So the application's open January 28th. If you're interested, feel free to jump in here and scan this QR code, and that takes you to the landing page. And the applications are open until March 13th this year. In case you are interested in attending an in-person fair as well to speak with program representatives in person, this is a list of some of our upcoming events. So we're just about a third of the way through the circuit at this point, but we will be in the Chicago area this weekend and then moving on from there. So you're in the right place right now being here for the virtual event, but if you are interested in an in-person opportunity, just take a look. This information is also on our website. And lastly, just for some sort of housekeeping, if you look at on your dashboard for Zoom, there should be a Q&A box. So please feel free to send in any questions there, and I'm happy to try to answer those while Holly is presenting. But please note that we are also going to have time for Q&A at the end, and Holly is going to share a lot of incredible information with you all this evening. So I would encourage you to hold your questions because I think there's a likelihood that it would be answered. But if you do have anything that I can assist with while she's chatting, feel free to send that into the Q&A box. And otherwise, if you want to send in questions at the end, then we will also answer some of those live. So keep that in mind towards the end of the presentation. So now I am excited to officially hand it over to Holly. As I mentioned, she is an accredited gap year counselor through the Gap Year Association and has decades of experience working with gap year students to help them plan their gap years. So a wealth of knowledge to share with you this evening. So excited to pass it over to you, Holly, and I'll just go ahead and keep moving slides for you.
Thank you. Thank you, Margot. It's really nice to have you host. I've known Margot for a while, and she's been a great contributor to the gap year field. So I'm Holly Bull. As Margot said, I'm a gap year counselor. So all I do is gap year counseling. And my company, the Center for Interim Programs, has been doing this work longer than anyone in the US. We started in 1980. And my father, who was a teacher and a headmaster for many years, saw a need for something like this. So he was a real pioneer in the field. And at this point, we're on our 45th year, so we're celebrating 45 years doing this work, mostly with students, but we actually work with all ages. And at this point, we have close to 9,000 people with whom we've worked, and many, many options that we've been vetting over the years. So we really have seen this field basically since its inception, I would say, in the United States in the early years. I have worn a lot of hats in this field. I am a gap year counselor, obviously, for 38 years now. I ran the US program in Greece that I attended on my own gap year because I took 2 gap years myself, one before college and one after my sophomore year. And the picture that you see there is actually me at 17, working in Hawaii at an aquaculture research center, trying to decide if I wanted to be a marine biologist, and I figured out, no, I probably don't have the patience for this. So I'm a good example of somebody who is checking out these different interests, and it really gave me more clarity before heading off to college. And then I also have 2 daughters who both did gap time before college, and I probably reference Samantha and Leah as we go along here. So like I said, I've done lots of different experiences, marine bio. I went to Greece, I went to India and Nepal. I worked at where the first midwife program was set up in the United States. And I am biased in favor of gap time, but only if somebody wants to do it. I'm really clear this is the student's life, not mine. Okay, the next slide, please. So most people know what a gap year is these days. When we first started, people really didn't know, and there wasn't even a term for it. Now, I wouldn't call it mainstream, but there's definitely more awareness and support. And this explanation of what it is very broad, but to my mind, it really is just this chance to explore interests and skills, but with intentionality. You're not just, taking a year off or taking time off, and this is not a vacation year. You're very much on. Actually, I call this a year on, not a year off. And typically it is between high school and college or during college, and usually around 3 to 9 months. And people are very much on because you're stepping into things that are different from what you've done before. So people tend to come kind of back alive often if they've been on slightly automatic pilot moving through their final years of school. And it really is a gift. For those of you who are parents listening to this or older adults, it's much harder later in your life to take this kind of time. Buying time, having a chance to explore when you're not tied to much is definitely a gift that is harder to get at later. Okay, next slide, please. So who takes a gap year? Really anybody who's interested. I mean, like I said, it's all different ages, all different types of learning styles, all different income levels. You do not have to bleed financially to have a great gap year. There are many low-cost options you can consider. And you don't have to be good at anything. You don't have to have experience. Typically, you're not being graded. And I mean, you could be terrible at something. Who cares? It's all for learning. So it's just this chance to explore and learn. Next slide. Now, for me as a counselor doing this work for so many years, this is why I love this work. This core value that I describe as leading from, the inside out. Because if you think about it, so much of our early lives and our later lives somewhat, we're really responding to all these directives coming at us. I have to do this, I'm supposed to do that. What will people think? Blah, blah, blah. And with gap time, you're really stepping back from that and starting to lead from the core. The who am I? What am I interested in? And then I choose and own what I'm up to. That's the beginning of personal power because you have a year where you're practicing what it feels like to choose and create your life. And I think that is something that's hard to measure in terms of a value of gap time, but it's really evident when you're in the presence of people who've done this sense of self and self-confidence. Next slide. This is an old book some of you may have seen, as New York Times bestseller, Daniel Pink's book Drive, and the surprising truth about what motivates us. And he boils it down to these three things: autonomy, mastery, and purpose. And what's interesting I find about this is that you don't have in school much, I mean, you have some mastery of material. You don't have a full sense of autonomy often, and or a sense of real core personal purpose. But with gap time, all three of these elements that motivate people are in play. You definitely have more of a sense of autonomy. You're learning skills, you're gaining mastery, and you also are determining or figuring out what your sort of personal person, your core like reason for being is. And so, next slide, please. This takes us into the benefits, which is improved self-motivation. So obviously, if you're, going towards something you're excited about, you're going to be more self-motivated. Students don't even realize this is happening. They're just going towards something that draws them. Another benefit here is resting. I think it takes a lot to knock the vitality out of an 18-year-old, but that's what I see when I'm working with some of these students who've been churning their way through school, and by senior year, they can be a little fried. Or the pandemic just did a number on this generation. So buying time, not to goof off, but just rest, rejuvenate, I think is really helpful. And then the relevance of your studies to the world. Now, this for me was a big one by senior year. I go from math class to history to Spanish. How does this stuff connect? How is it relevant to the world? So gap time really brings one's learning alive often. And students are learning how to budget. My family, I was on a tight budget, so I paid for all the airfare during my year, and I asked my daughters to do the same. I thought that was fair. And then, one program I did was volunteer. One program was the splurge for my parents, but it was a really reasonable costing year for my family. And I think, it can be whatever budget you have to work with is doable. And I think for students to really think about that, because normally in college they may not, some are, but sometimes students are just going on to college and they're not really thinking about a need to budget or what things cost. So that's a nice benefit right there. And then everything you do during gap time goes on a resume. I mean, you're front loading skills that are going to be so useful, for you, not only navigating college, but moving into the work world beyond college. And I think sometimes people don't realize what students are garnering um, in terms of these skills that a lot of college graduates don't have. I mean, they're very good at school, but they haven't had to grapple with all the other things that students are taking on during gap time. And some of these things can help you get jobs, and I saw that with both my daughters. So the next one here, the college and career clarity. This is really helpful. I mean, for me, it was really helpful to figure out, okay, no, I don't think I want to do marine biology. So let me tick that one off as a potential major. I had a young woman years ago who went off and um, uh, shadowed doctors, so she was thinking she might want to be a surgeon. And it only took about, I don't know, it was 3 or 4 weeks. And she came back home and told her parents, I don't think I'll be a surgeon. I will be a surgeon. So for her, it was just that clarity. And when she told me that, I remember the hair went up in the back of my neck. I thought, whoa, nothing is going to get in this young woman's way. And you need that clarity if you're going to go to med school. And then again, jobs post-college. So how you transition from college into the work world is often easier because you've got this half step into the world that you're taking with gap time. And I saw this absolutely directly with my stepdaughter Samantha, who took a gap year before college. She did an internship in Ireland when she was about 19, working for a little startup company. It was just an art co-op. It wasn't anything terribly profound, but 3 months living independently in housing with fellow interns. She had to navigate the city, show up every day, do the work. And by the end of it, they told her, "Hey, Samantha, you're good at business. You could run this place." She's like, "Great. I like business. I'm not sure I want to work with artists." She was at this co-op. It drove her nuts because they weren't terribly organized. So it's like, great. Now you know what kind of working style you have and who you might want to be around. She also didn't like the weather. She said, "I need the sun." But what was interesting about that experience, she said, "I am pretty sure I got my job with IBM right out of college based on that internship I did at 19 in Dublin." She said that's all we talked about during the interview. And IBM actually told her, "Samantha, you got this job in part because of your gap year." So if you look at what an employer is looking for, it's like, great, you've got a really good GPA, you've done well in school, but can you show up and do the work? And do you know how to initiate projects? I mean, a lot of initiating energy is what students are learning, or how to work with people or roll with change. These are some of the skills that these students are getting and that they take right into the next stage of their life. Okay, next slide. Thank you. Oops, other way. All right, so this is a concern people have. Like, how do gap year students perform in college? Or students will say, if I step away from formal academics for a period of time, what's going to happen? And the myth is these students are going to lose academic momentum if they step away from formal studies. But the reality is, on average, they're performing at higher levels than non-gap year students. And anecdotally, and we have almost 9,000 alums at this point, the common refrain anecdotally that we're hearing is, "I'm a better student. My child's a better student." But the next slide will show you some older data here. And this is Bob Clagett's data from, you can see 2011, 2014. So it's older data, but it's still relevant because what he started to do at Middlebury is just look at the GPAs of the gap year students in blue, compared to the peers in red. And these students typically hadn't done formal academics for a full year, but they were landing it at Middlebury and outperforming themselves, based on their own academic history, as well as outperforming a number of their peers. So it's pretty steady across the board. The other thing that Bob noticed is that the Feb admits at Middlebury, so people who just had 3 months away in the fall, a disproportionate number of them walked away with all the leadership awards at Middlebury. It's like, what's happening in 3 months that's affecting that kind of a change in the students? And I put it to, it's all these benefits I'm talking about. They had to think more proactively. What do I do with my fall? And then they took that proactive energy into Middlebury and were better students as a result. The next slide will show Bob's data for UNC Chapel Hill. So he crunched the GPA numbers um, at UNC Chapel Hill. Same results, even more dramatic. The GPAs are higher of the gap year students. And again, these students typically aren't doing formal academics for the whole gap year, and they're still better students. So you might be a little rusty, but you do not forget how to learn. And normally these students hit the ground running. I definitely did when I went to college. Next slide is another higher ed person. This is Mark Hatch. And I've been on lots of gap year panels over the years with Bob and Mark. Mark also is in Harvard admissions, and now he's still in Colorado College admissions. And this was over 10 years ago. I was on a panel with Mark at a big NACAC conference, and he was saying the similar thing. So the first year GPAs are higher of these gap year students at CC. This was interesting. The young men who took gap time were outperforming non-gap year female peers, which is statistically unusual. And these students were way outperforming non-gap year male peers. And these students, male, female, leaders on campus, fewer behavioral issues and dramas, a lot of the things that can derail people first year, freshman year, coming out of high school and home, just not even on the radar screen for gap year students. So, and also he said these students are finishing college in 4 years or fewer. So they're really efficient students. They're not changing majors or changing schools as much as other students. They also started at Colorado College to look at levels of anxiety and depression going down and lower numbers of disciplinary incidents. And at that point, he said, we'd like to see 20% of the incoming freshmen have taken gap time. I think they're between 7 and 10% at this point. Um, the other thing that Mark said, which was interesting and unusual at the time, over 10 years ago, he said, if you're applying to Colorado College, tell us you've done a gap year or you're planning to take one. He said, it's going to help you get in. It's not a guarantee, but it, it will definitely help because you're a better student for us. You make us look good. Next slide, please. All right, so here's what you want to watch out for when you're planning gap time. I mean, ideally, you don't want to force a gap year on someone. This belies the whole power of choosing. You can, I think, inspire people, and that's what I do, but I never want to force somebody to do this, including my two daughters. I didn't force them. I was hoping they would do it, but it was their choice. And you want to make sure you're landing in options that are well run. So it's nice to be as safe as you can be in this world and not wasting time on a poorly organized, dud placement, basically. And then the year itself needs some thought because often people are doing combinations of things during the year. So you need to put some thought into it because you don't want too many gaps during your gap year. It doesn't mean you pack every moment, but you definitely don't want to have too much downtime at home without enough to do. So that it does take work. And just also making sure that you have reasonable expectations about the process and about the options. Yeah, it's definitely more moving parts to this whole process. College in some ways is no brainer. It's not that different from high school. You're still going from class to class. It's all set up for you. Gap time does require people to be more engaged and, changing their plans, and students change and plans change, and that's totally normal and appropriate for what's happening. So with this more untraditional path, you might need a bit more support and guidance. So seek that out if you need it. And then just people worry about, uh, adding another year in the process of a student's education. What's the affordability? And I'll talk more about that when we talk about program types. Okay, next slide, please. So here's back one. Thanks. Here's what I hear from students. Back one. Okay, thank you, Margot. This is important because I think this is what students often are bringing up with me as concerns. I don't want to get behind my high school class, or am I going to be too old as a college freshman, or I'll forget how to learn? And the reality here is, I don't mean to discount how people feel, but it just doesn't play out the way people worry. So really, as a gap year student, when everyone graduates from high school, you're kind of on a parallel track. So you're heading off to your own thing while your friend's going off to college or whatever they're doing, but you're going towards something ideally you want to be doing. And you're connected often in with a peer group of people who normally would be in college. They've chosen to do gap time too. So you're not disconnected or behind. And not that this is a competition, but quite honestly, the by virtue of all of these things that you're garnering during a gap year, you are way ahead of peers who might graduate a year ahead of you in college. So that is more what I see, um, even if it doesn't feel that way as a student at this stage. The other thing is, am I going to be too old? I mean, luckily you're not so age bound in college, so it doesn't matter so much. And people are older. I mean, it takes many students 5 or 6 years to finish college because they're changing majors, changing schools. So it's quite an age range in college. And there are more gap year students in college. And you can join clubs and find the kindred spirits. You only need a few of them. You don't have to just align yourself with your freshman class. And I think students realize that pretty quickly. Okay, next slide. We'll talk about some program ideas here or program options. So when I talk about programs or options, I separate them into four main categories. So this first category are the facilitated peer group options. And these are the ones that often will show up at the fairs. These are the ones you'll see online if you're searching for gap year programs. They provide a lot of structure and support for students. And typically, There are full year programs, but I think since the pandemic, more things are shorter. So you're looking at like 2.5, 3 months, fall or spring, that these programs are running. And they could be cultural study focused, so that's homestays, service projects, adventure travel, sightseeing all woven together with like 10 or 12 peers and leaders. It could be something that's more outdoor oriented, getting outdoor skills. This is what my daughter did during her gap year with a group of fellow students. The picture on the far left there. It could be, marine related experiences. It could be focusing on art history or studio art, language immersion, academics. Sometimes people are going off and doing a semester of classes if they want to do that. But and these you're paying the most for. They do have scholarships, many of them, if you're on a budget. And many of them might be accredited through the GYA program, the setup. So you could potentially use 529 plan money for these. Okay, next slide is the next category. And these are what I call skill-based intensive. So these are shorter, 1 to 4 weeks, US and abroad. They set up housing for you. You land, you're with fellow students, could be a range of ages, and you're engaging in learning some specific thing. So that you're really focused on this course of study or training in a short period of time, and you might come away with a certification. So it could be cooking intensives, learning how to teach skiing, or snowboarding or yoga. You might be building a guitar. You might be getting your, medical training, wilderness EMT or woofer. It could be cooking intensives. I mentioned already. You've got programs you might learn how to run a recording studio or filmmaking, writing intensives. So these are great. You can tuck these into gap time now or down the line as a way of systematically picking off interests one by one, because these don't take that much time. So you're paying a fee for these, but it's less because it's shorter periods of time, and you're still connected with a group. The next slide is a more independent type of program. So these are the urban internships where you go more independently to a placement, usually a city, and you're working with a provider who does nothing but set up internships for a couple of $1,000, and then they arrange the housing and the whole setup for you just to launch the student. People do squawk at me, why am I paying to go work for someone, Holly? And it's like, well, these are really hard to find for gap year students, and they are so incredibly practical. I mean, if you're going to splurge on something, I think these internships are really, really useful. So these tend to run 2 to 3 months. They could be in Europe, they could be in Africa, they could be in Argentina, they could be in Australia. These are students. The fellow on the far left is doing an internship in England at a museum, a war museum. The young woman on the far right is actually a good friend of my daughter Leah's, and she was working at a medical clinic in a maternity clinic in Africa. And then the picture in the middle there is actually at the Dining Me program, so people working in the automotive industry. There are also, by the way, hybrid programs. So there are group, like facilitated group programs that also do set up internships for students. So you have the same group of gap year peers start to finish for 2.5, 3 months, but they're doing internships in those placements. So that's a really nice option as well. Okay, next slide. This is the last category, the volunteer work experiences. So these are the first three categories are ones that are really set up for you, and you're paying a fee for those. This category, you're going to be of service to someone or something. So it could be coaching kids in sports, assist teaching in classrooms, working with animals, wild or domestic. You could be doing disaster relief work, helping to rebuild, post fire damage or earthquake damage, hurricane damage, US or abroad. And many of these will give you housing and food in exchange for your labor, conservation projects. So there's a whole range of these. They're all over the world, all different lengths of time, all different ages, more low cost, more rural, typically. So you can weave these into gap time, and it's a great way to bring the cost down. And I find that many students are starting out with more structure and support, but then they move into more independent placements like this as they go along. Okay, next slide, please. So this is just a sample gap year. It doesn't have to follow this blueprint, but this is a nice way to break it down. You see, it pretty much follows a school calendar, which is nice for students because they can then check back in with friends and family the way they normally would if they'd gone off to college. So summer, generally, I find that people are working, are doing their own thing or chipping in. I usually, even if students don't have to, I often recommend, it's like, why don't you work and chip in? This is your year. Take responsibility for it financially as well, in part. And then in the fall, something that will fill the fall could be a group program or something that suits an area of interest, but a little more structure and support. And then home for a break. Sometimes students are reapplying to colleges or applying to colleges halfway through a gap year. It's often easier to do this through your senior year and then ask for a deferral, and then it's set. You don't have to think about it. However, we do have some students who are looking at the college application process in the midst, and it's not a guarantee, but it definitely puts you in a different bracket because your whole senior year they're going to see. Ideally, you want grades level or up, and you can talk about what you're doing on your gap year and your experience in the fall. And then the winter to spring, you can see there may be more independent placement. Sometimes people will do another group program, but you could do as many as, 2, 3, 4, 5 different things during a gap year at different areas of interest. Because some options could be, 2 days that you're tucking in. As I said, more isn't necessarily better, but there's something to fill the fall and that winter, spring, and then you've got that following summer. What I see sometimes is students are finishing up with free travel toward the end of a gap year, which is a great skill. You got to figure out how to get from A to B. And I think learning just how to handle that is a part of the gap year process. My daughter traveled for about a month at the end of her gap year. She said, I don't think I could have set this up in the same way at the start of my gap year. She just traveled around Europe. And I didn't do anything. She bought the flights, she found the youth hostels. It was a great practical learning experience for her. And she's very good at organizing that kind of thing now. Okay, next slide. Here's an example of one of my students, Mary, from a year or so ago, just a low cost gap here. So if you're really looking at wanting to keep the costs down, work in the summer as Mary did. She did volunteer work as well. So she started out with a program in Guatemala that was very low cost. And then she stepped into an internship in the fall working with middle school students, almost like being a camp counselor during the gap year. So it was a mountain campus, and that gave her housing, food, and a bit of a stipend, and she could save a bit of money. And then she went off and worked at a youth hostel for housing and food in the Netherlands. And then she came home and worked again, this local dog walking job she had. And then her splurge was going to South Africa doing an internship, a medical internship. And then again, working in the summer and then heading off to college. So again, pretty reasonable costing year. I believe, gave her a scholarship for our fee. So again, you can look at, if you always should ask for scholarship for assistance if you need it from anybody. Gap year counselors, programs, this is a wonderful field. We're really trying to help people. Okay, next slide. Thank you. All right, so some tips about funding. I think it's really important, for parents to sit down with the student and say, hey, here's what we can comfortably or willing to put toward your gap year, or here's what we'd like you to chip in. So just have that conversation about defining the budget and then start researching, the program costs. You've got the room and board to programs with fees, tuitions, but also scholarships. You have the accredited programs where you might be able to use the 529 plan money. So check into that. Everybody loves hearing about a gap year. Do some crowdfunding. You might say, hey, I'll write a blog and you all can follow what I'm doing and live vicariously through me. But please chip in for my travel or whatever. And then working in the summers, obviously you can work in between as well. And there are quite an array of these housing and food for labor options, whether AmeriCorps, City, or Woofing, and more. Some people also will just choose to work either for part of a gap year or the whole gap year. You don't have to go and do exotic things on a gap year to get benefit from it. It really comes down to how you feel about what you're up to. So there are options that will set you up with jobs that you can look at as well. And then, the scholarships, the financial aid, definitely talk to programs, the Gap Year Association, Go Overseas. Margot has just described some of the scholarships that Go Overseas and the Gap Year Fairs are offering. And then I think the next slide is the guidebook slide, right, Margot, where you can, yeah, so this just as an example of the virtual guide for the fairs, you can see financial support information on that page and which programs are providing it. So that's a nice resource there. Okay, next slide. All right, so how and when do you start? Okay, you can start anytime. However, by spring of senior year, you definitely want to get cracking on it. People worry that they need to start early on. I think fall of senior year, people are really busy with college applications. They do not need to or want to be thinking about planning a gap year normally. So just, that's fine. They can kick into it January onward. Definitely check your passport. Make sure it's good 6 months beyond whenever you're going to get back from your gap year. And check travel and the health requirements. So normally students are traveling as tourists. There are some places like Japan where you can't take like ADHD medication. They won't let you in with it. So you need to make sure that you can get in if you have medications you might be taking and the places that you want to go. You just want to look online about that. And then make sure you have mental health supports in place if that's something that you need. Check with the colleges for the deferrals because some of the state universities, for example, in California, they don't defer. It's not that they have anything against a gap year, I don't think. I think it's just a bureaucratic issue. So they may want you to reapply. And so you want to check in the pool of colleges you're looking at if you are able to defer. Your college counselors can help with that. Most colleges will defer you. And they may say, fine, take your gap year, but just don't, we'll defer you, but don't garner credit or only so much credit. So you want to find out about that as well. All right. Oh, and if you have scholarship or financial aid, make sure you check on that to see if that can be deferred as well. Sometimes it won't be because they need to disperse that money in that year. So that's important to check. Yeah, Go Overseas. They have a nice gap matcher. You can use our interest sheet on our website. I'm a gap year counselor, Interim Programs. Just harvest our site. There's so much information there. And our interest sheet just helps students tick off locations, areas of interest. It kind of provides it for them. And I think that's just a really good exercise. And then just start matching your interests with options through fairs, your online resources. Talk to gap year counselors. Many of us will do free brainstorming sessions just to help you map things out at least initially and to reassure parents and students in the process. And then if you're vetting websites on your own and looking at them, this TLC test was set up by Kate Warren, my co-counselor, who's been with me for years, and she is just phenomenal. And she's also my director of research. And so she's set this up as like when you're looking at websites, the TLC test is transparency. So you want to see, are there people and photos of them on the site, people who run it? Are there bios on them? Is the contact information on the website? And what's their base of operation? And then legitimacy would be things like, okay, is this a corporation? Is it nonprofit? Can you see who's governing it, like the board of directors? What's the oversight? Do they have professional affiliations? Are they, GYA or year out accredited? And then competency would be the training of staff, their education, their life experience, how long they've been in business. Are they able to do good work with their student, with your student on the ground? Okay. And then one thing I find is just really helpful is talk with the people who run these programs, and you can ask for recent alumni who've been on them or parent referrals. It really helps to talk to students, I find. And the question to ask somebody is not how was it, this experience, but what was the worst aspect? Because that's what you want to know. You want to have a sense of, okay, what am I being prepared for here with this experience? Okay, next slide, please. All right, so this is a funny slide that I like to talk about because this is so much our, the top plan is so much our Western lives. We're so linear and goal oriented and our education is that way. And even people's gap year plans, that's kind of our mentality. But life isn't that tidy. Life is below. It's the ups, the downs, it's the challenges you're facing. It's also the richness of life experience that you're garnering through your gap time. So all the skills that go into navigating all that experience that you're front loading, I think is really one of the marvelous aspects of gap time if you're up for it. I mean, it does take, you know, a willingness to step into this process, but you don't have to hurl yourself out into the, you can give yourself the landing pads. Okay, next slide. These are some helpful resources. So obviously you've got the USA Gap Year Fairs and Go Overseas. The Year Out Group is a British organization that vets programs, British and other programs, and the Gap Year Association is the American version of that that's been running over a decade here in the States. So really nice resources, providing all kinds of information. And then there are a number of Gap Year advisors that are listed on the Gap Year Association website these days. I'm one of the accredited gap year counselors, so programs and counselors have to go through an accreditation process if they want to be accredited, and it's quite grueling. So you know that they're ideally doing a great job. So look at these resources, all of them. These are the main ones. And then if you have further questions, I think we're on to the questions slide here, if any have been thrown into the chat. Margot's going to let us know here.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Holly. That was a wonderful, wonderful information shared. And we have had a couple of questions come in. I've kind of been answering as they come, but I think there's some that could be beneficial for you to share with everyone here and that could be, just great to discuss.
Sure.
So I know you talked about like college deferrals and what can be, good times to apply to college, but we did have a question about students postponing taking their SATs or ACTs and until, during the gap year. And just curious what your thoughts are on that. Obviously, that would impact the application process, but have you seen students wait to take those tests until during their gap year?
I mean, I have. I think it's often easier to do that as you're going through the high school process with the support of, you know, the high school and the counselors. But if somebody is just really not wanting to do that, they can, again, that's the benefit of buying time with the gap year. So they can, I mean, I remember one student did it in the summer after they finished high school. So they were preparing then for the application process in the fall, which they did as part of their gap time. And then they stepped into programs after that. I think it depends on the student, but if you can tuck something into the fall, sometimes it's nice to actually engage in something or look forward to something and not just spend the whole fall working on college applications if you can avoid it. The other thing to watch out for, I would say, with the fall, if you're home and everybody's gone, it can be lonely. So you want to make sure that you either have some kind of a community base that's good and you're fine with that, or ideally you're kind of weaving in a short group experience of something, some sort, as in the fall.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Awesome. Great info. We just had another question come in just about programs, or like if there are students who might need a little bit more time to mature before heading into their gap year, or who might need some more support if they have, if they're neurodiverse, are there programs and options that you are aware of that are specifically geared towards that type of student?
Yeah, I think it's important to know that, the gap year programs, the gap year field is not like, it's healing, but they're not therapeutic. So you're sort of trying to gauge, how much support does a student need? If they really need a therapeutic program, there's sort of soft therapeutic options in the gap year field. Not the gap year field, sorry, but it's kind of like you've got gap year programs, you've got soft therapeutic, and then you have more wilderness therapy is kind of where I would put it.
Mhm.
What I often find though with students who might have learning differences or if they are neurodivergent, that they actually do fine with smaller programs with a common interest and the support of the leaders. So it just depends on how much support they might need, and that's the benefit of speaking with the programs. And they'll tell you, I think we can handle your child, or maybe this is a bit much, but at least you're going to know what's possible. Um, I definitely think that for students with learning differences, having gap time is phenomenal because you're playing to their learning style. Like if you have a student who has ADHD, they're going to be hyper focusing really well on things that they want to do in sort of short, intense bursts as they go through the year. And there isn't quite so much coming at them in terms of the academics. And so it gives them a year to really, I think, shore up self-confidence and realize, I'm fine and I'm doing something I want to do, and I get to do that the whole year. I'm just fine. So yeah, I know one thing my daughter said when she landed in college after a gap year. She said it was so much easier like to make friends on gap year programs because you're with smaller groups of people with a common interest. So I think the social environment is easier than the sea of freshmen in college, where, by the way, as a parent, you really don't have much sense of what's going on with your child. Whereas in a gap year program, you have leaders with whom you're in touch. I mean, you are going to be hearing feedback about how your child is doing on a gap year program.
Absolutely. Having worked for a program provider, I really want to highlight something you said there, Holly, of just
Yeah,
being super transparent with any program that you're chatting
yeah.
with and really explaining the situation to make sure that it feels like the right fit, both for you and for them. And that's really going to set the student up for best success. So couldn't agree with you more there.
Yeah, and don't and I think that's really, I'm glad you mentioned that because I find that programs are so willing to work with people, even if there's some issues going on, but as long as they know what they are, it's not going to keep a student from being able to attend. And Margot knows that better than I, having been on that end of it.
Totally. Totally. Okay, so I know that we're nearing time, but we had a couple more questions, so we can get those answered and then we can wrap up and let you all get on with your evening. But we did have a question about just general price, like what can a gap year cost, or like some of these programs, is there a range? I know there's a vast variety of costs in this case, but Holly, if you have any of that that you'd be willing to share.
Yeah, it runs the gamut. So, when I was talking about those four main categories, you've got on the low end the programs that will give you housing and food in exchange for labor, or you could be working. You have programs where you might pay a minimal cost for housing and food. You're not paying an overarching program fee. And then as you start to move into things like skill-based intensives that are 1 to 4 weeks, it could be several $1,000s that you're paying, and then some housing costs and food costs. It depends. It's sort of program by program. Internship placements, a couple thousand for a placement, and then housing and food costs. So again, if you're eating out a lot, costs can go up or down, and that's where students are really learning how to budget often. And then the high end would be the facilitated group programs. I mean, they're running anywhere from what, 17 to 20,000 a semester these days for 2.5, 3 months. So those would be the splurge, depending, on what you want to put toward the year. Students don't have to start with those. I mean, they can be really nice because they can take you to some far-flung places. They have sort of wonderful curriculum set up of hands-on learning and experiences arranged for you, and also the built, like the guarantee of peers and the leaders. But there are shorter ones that you can do as well. So I mean, again, it all depends on the budget that you're working within. Uh, I think what I find helpful when I'm brainstorming with people is to say, look at everything, just look at everything, see what you're drawn to, and then close doors later on based on cost, inclination, and so forth. But get a sense of the range. Years ago, we had a young woman who was really on a tight budget. She looked at this 3-month group program in Nepal, absolutely fell in love with it. She said, "Oh, I can't afford it." And then she went home and she said, I'm going to work through the summer and the fall, and I'm going to do it in the spring, and it's worth it to me to do that. And it was just such a great example of somebody considering something like, how do I make this work? And she was really glad she did it, and it worked out really well.
So thanks, Holly. Okay, we have a couple questions. There's two that are a little bit similar. So I'm kind of going to see if I can combine these so that it's applicable for both. But I know you talked about, again, college applications. Like, would you say most students apply during their senior year and go the deferral route? Or is it more common that they might wait and apply during the gap year or potentially reapply during the gap year? And how might that timing work? And then, yeah, just does the application process differ, I
Yeah,
guess?
I mean, I would say more students are applying during their senior year and asking for a deferral. I don't know
Mhm.
the exact percentage, of our students who are apply. I mean, I think fewer are applying halfway through a gap year. Um, More probably would be reapplying. So if they just don't like where they got in or they've changed their mind, that's when you see students going through that reapplication process. What I find with some students, if they just don't want to do a college application, I might say, hey, just go through the process in the senior year and just with the support. It'll take a trial run. And you might get in where somewhere and that you could defer. But it's not a huge process. It's more to learn how to do the process with the support of your counselors. And some of them might be fine with that, and some might then still go into that process halfway through the gap year. The timing is going to be the fall, so that's what I'm saying is it's if you take too much of your fall home just doing college applications when everybody else is gone, it really depends on the student, the individual, how they're going to handle that. And you also may want to circle back around to your high school and see if, or any of your college counselors to see if they'll help you again if you're working with your high school counselors. So prepare them for that because they've got the next wave of students with whom
Mhm.
they're dealing. So you want to make sure that's okay.
Absolutely. Okay, it looks like we have one more question, and then we can go ahead and wrap things up again to try to keep a little bit close to time. But there was a question just about students who might be specifically looking to focus on, maybe generally just specific interests, but this question specifically referring to like songwriting or performing music during the gap year. Any resources that might be helpful?
Yeah, that's it. The music is a tougher one. I mean, you can learn how to run a recording studio. There's a program where it's almost like an arts portfolio program in Colorado. It's called Made Life. So you can just focus on music and they provide the facilities and mentorship. It used to be a wonderful jazz program in the States, but they didn't last through the pandemic. Um, Yeah, it's a tougher one. I wish there was more actually in it. So I think there's like flamenco guitar playing too. And then there's more the recording arts. So doing an internship in the music industry would be another way of getting at that. But if I missed the question, it was more playing and what kind of instrument. Do you have a sense of that? Did they say that?
It did not say in this specific question,
Okay.
but just
Well,
somebody who wants to,
call me. Talk
yeah,
to me.
exactly.
Yeah, no,
Wonderful.
I'm always happy to brainstorm with people. I mean, we don't charge for our brainstorming. It'd be crazy not to follow up just for a conversation that's more specific to the student's interests. Okay.
Advantage of that, absolutely. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Holly. This has been so informative, and hopefully for all of you, this has been a really useful resource to kind of give you the general overview of what all a gap year could entail, or as you're digging into that planning process. So before we go, I did want to just share one more resource for you that we were offering to everyone for this evening. Unfortunately, we're running our live events during the winter, so we did have an event get canceled earlier this month due to a snowstorm. And so we have tried to offer a sort of virtual fair experience for anyone who's here tonight, and especially for the folks who were unable to attend that in-person fair. So I'm going to see if I can just pull this up for you all. And here I'm just going to stop share for a moment and pull up that. Basically, we have set up a virtual fair space that has all of the programs that would have been present for this in-person event. And so I will share this with everyone after this evening so that you can take a look at it. But here, let me pull up. So I just wanted to give you all a quick overview. So this is what our virtual fair space is going to look like. So you can come in here and you can peruse different programs. You can see Holly with the Center for Interim Programs is on here, as well as a number of different program offerings. And so not only is this going to give you just who would have been at an in-person event, but it's going to give you a brief overview of that program. It's going to give you the type of program that they are. So are they international? Is it an internship? Is it a language school? It'll give you some of the locations where that organization runs programs. Also, we've linked the Go Overseas review page for those programs, so you can look at those alumni reviews. We also have a info session sort of video, which is kind of like what you might have experienced at a fair. It's sort of their elevator pitch, so to speak. So really brief overview just to give you the nuts and bolts of the program, as well as their admissions contact, their phone number, and a way to schedule a call with them. So if you are interested in learning more about any of these programs or just perusing this as a resource, we're hoping that this can be really helpful and sort of, even though it's not in person, simulate some of that information you might have gained from an actual fair. So I will be following up with that information when I send my follow-up emails by the end of the week. So keep an eye out for that. But otherwise, thank you all for joining, and we hope that you have a lovely evening.
Thank you, Margot, and good night, everybody. Take care.